Scott Shea, author of All the Leaves Are Brown. I am so excited to be talking to you. You're my producer. I don't blame you for anything on the Catholic channel on Sirius. That's how we know each other. And I have to tell you, first of all, I've been wanting to do this interview for a long time, and I didn't tell you because you'd think I was crazy, but you already know that. I thought of you basically every day during fall because all the leaves are brown. And I
We're
thought,
brown.
we have to talk about the book. But even more importantly than that, I am super inspired by what you did with this book
Oh,
because you sought out to write a book. You wrote it even without like a full-on plan or contract. And now it's a real mainstream book that was just named by Variety as one of the best music books of the year. That's pretty incredible. Um also, so how did that come about? Why did you, and what does it have to do with Pope Francis?
well, yeah. Well, that's a good point. It started off, yeah, really going back to Pope Francis's visit here to the United States. Was that 2015, I believe?
And I should
And
interrupt for people who don't know, this book is about the mamas and the papas. So
yeah, it's
Pope
not about Pope
Francis, mamas and the
Francis.
papas, go.
About as far away from each other as you could possibly get, or I don't know.
Well, it depends on the headline.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, we had a program director at the time named Liz Ayala, who I thank in the opening of the book. She kind of recognized in me a love for telling a story and history. I'm big on Catholic history as well as, U.S. history, just history in general, and music history. Music history is my passion, and music. I love music, especially rock and roll, the early, the first, I should say the early years, but like the first 25 years or 30 years of rock and roll, and all the subgenres that circulate around it and have created from it.
Is
And
that like the classic oldies, basically?
yeah, I mean, we got rock and roll, you got rhythm and blues, you got country and western. Yes, I should say popular music and all the different
Okay.
subgenres. From post World War II on. Yes, it's always just been a passion of mine since I was a little kid. And so she recognized that in me and asked me to put together a documentary on the life of Pope Francis. So she wanted some original content coming out that we can just, kind of just throw on and have as an evergreen kind of thing too for the future. So I put that together. It was a lot of stuff. So we ended up having to break it into two parts because we wanted to, talk about his early life, which is fascinating in South America, as a Jesuit during that time of, all the political unrest and I forget the name of it's escaping me now. The name of the
Liberation theology and all
yeah,
of,
liberation theology and the dictator who ran Argentina. I
right,
forget
right.
forget what his name was, but it's escaping me now. I was obsessed with it for a while there, um,
Throne.
but yeah, Perón. And so so we broke it up into two pieces. His early life and then his life as a bishop, leading up to being named Pope, and the very first months of his papacy. So that went over very well, and then it led to other documentaries. I did one on Mother Teresa and Pope Benedict the 16th, and then they asked me to do one on the history of the Catholic Channel for our 10th anniversary, which seems like it's approaching our 10th anniversary of our 10th anniversary. Uh,
Mm.
so, um, so it really it kind of awoken in me my love for research and talking to people and getting the bottom of the story. And so I thought I would really like to write a book. I'm an avid reader. I love reading. Always reading, and especially music books, music biographies, and things like that. So I decided to write a book, and so I was like, but I didn't have a topic, and I knew the era I wanted to kind of focus in. So I was reading books about kind of folk rock, artists, and that was a period, in the mid '60s that was kind of influenced by the folk boom of the late '50s and early '60s, and then Beatlemania, which had come, around 1964 to the United States, and it was just kind of a response to that. A lot of folk musicians, started picking up electric guitars and making rock and roll music, like Paul Simon. I, read about Paul Simon and Bob Dylan, and Gene Clark of the Byrds. And I remember thinking, I'd like to read about John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. He was a very creative guy, kind of up there with Brian Wilson in terms of the Beach Boys, in terms of, his composing abilities and his ear for music and harmony. And I couldn't find anything. There hadn't been any really books written about in at least 15 years. And the ones that were available were really kind of short, that kind of, for my money, just not really complete. And then John and Michelle Phillips had both put out autobiographies in the mid 1980s, and a lot of time had passed since then. So I was like, I felt like that was God saying, boom, here's your answer. This is who you're going to write about. And, I started writing about John Phillips, who's not a very savory character. And interesting that I would be pointed in that direction. But, the story really, it just became the story. You can't tell the story of John Phillips without telling the story of the Mamas and the Papas. And that kind of took over. And at some point around 2019, when I was done writing up to the point about the end of the Mamas and the Papas in 1968, I decided, let's make this a Mamas and Papas biography, and I'll finish it up and leave it at their final break-off point in 1971, and we'll shop it around.
Well, you mentioned the unsavoriness. I remember when you first sent me some chapters of the book to read, and I thought, oh, wow, this is not the lives of the saints,
No.
to say the least. Now, what, and I know, and you mentioned God sending you this direction, and I know you prayed about it. How do you kind of reconcile, your day job and your faith with getting into the weeds of lots of unfaithfulness and all the rest?
Well, listen, I mean, that's the story of humanity. I mean, that stuff's in the Bible,
Right,
I
right.
mean, there are saints who were like that,
Saint
who had,
Augustine.
yeah, I mean, Saint Mary Magdalene, lots, yeah, Saint Paul talks about dealing with, an affliction that he doesn't really mention, but, and I think that's purposeful because we can, like, all kind of, lean on Saint Paul for prayer when we're dealing with our own personal demons. So, I was just telling a story. I wasn't endorsing what John Phillips had
Right,
did. I wasn't endorsing the 1960s. And I really went just I really kind of went matter of fact and just didn't want to sensationalize the whole thing. I'm an observer from another time period,
right.
observing this period that I'm very familiar with through 30 years or more of reading and listening and just ensconcing myself in this time period, and just trying to share that story with listeners, as kind of a disaffected or unaffected observer, which people do. And we're kind of in that phase now where we're going to have to do that because a lot of these people are no longer with us that we can reach out and talk to. Three of the four mamas and the papas have passed away. And for a guy with no book deal and no literary agent. I tried reaching out to Michelle Phillips and Lou Adler, but that wasn't. I didn't have high hopes for that, and neither of them panned out. But Michelle put out an autobiography in 1986 that gave me a lot of good information about the band, and had done many interviews and had been involved in many documentaries. So there's a lot of information to glean. I would have for sure liked to have talked to her, um, but even other people, even people within their inner circle have since passed. And I don't know if you know Brett Thoman. He's an author,
Yeah.
who really focuses on Saint Francis of Assisi, and we have him on our show quite often. And he put out a great book on the life. It was very influential for me, on the life uh, of the Franciscan order immediately after Saint Francis died, and his friend, who I can't remember his name, but who was with him there, from the beginning, took it over and almost ruined it.
Mhm.
And he has, he personally, he makes you feel like you're right there, right inside which is what I sought to do in my book. I really wanted to put you in the moment and make you live this story in real time as it happened.
Is it but having dived so deep into the mamas and the papas, and from all of your reading about figures in rock and roll, is it possible to live a moral life in that mix?
It doesn't draw moral people for the most part. I mean, it really it's kind of like in my business in radio. Not I don't want to point anybody out in the Catholic channel, but there's ego in the Catholic channel with some people, and
People have
there's
egos? Wow.
yeah, and it really attracts narcissists. Any form of entertainment. So yeah, it's
Like
possible for sure.
politics.
But I think, yeah, for sure, like politics, but I think, if you're truly uh into your faith, you're not going to last very long in that world. And we've seen actors and actresses leave Hollywood. In fact, the I forget, I'm not good with names today, but that actress from the 50s who went in to become a cloistered nun, or I don't know if she's cloistered, but she became a nun. She was,
Dolores Hart, right,
yeah,
right.
Dolores Hart. She left and became a religious, and there are other people too.
After
Uh,
starring opposite Elvis Presley.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I think it's possible to live a moral life, but it's compromised quite often, I would say, in the world of film and music in Hollywood.
Well, I was talking to our mutual friend Mike Aquilina about the fact we were going to be talking today, who's a Catholic author, but who also has collaborated with Dion. And he says Dion talks about, and others, about like a trauma that exists in pop music. Is that something you saw in the story of the Mamas and the Papas?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's people a lot of the I think a lot of the narcissism stems from trauma.
Hmm.
John Phillips had a very traumatic childhood. His father was an alcoholic. His mother she wasn't abusive to him. She loved him, but she was mentally abusive at times, especially when she got older. And she was unfaithful to her father, and she also got into alcohol. So it had a traumatic effect on him, it led, I think, to him wrestling with a lot of his demons. And then, yeah, it causes trauma because, for there was a lot of betrayal, in infidelity within that group, and it has to have a traumatic effect on you, and causes you to maybe lean more on the bottle or on drugs to get you through it. And just really the trauma of breaking into the business is very hard. You do compromise a lot. It's not always like, compromising in a sexual way or something like that. Of course, that does happen, but you do compromise morals. Friends turn on friends. There are countless stories of bands that got together and went out to try to make a record deal, and they sign with it, and then after the first single, the record label, all they wanted was the lead singer, and they dumped all the rest, or maybe kept the lead singer and the guitarist, and and things like that happen. And it busts up friendships, and or even people who went into together, like the Rolling Stones. They've been together for so long that they're hardly even friends anymore. They've been hanging out with each other since 1962, these guys, and here we are in 2023, the end of 2023. And, you know, uh, two of them are, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards are still there. And Ronnie Wood, who knew them back in those days, has been playing with them since 1976, which is as long as I've been alive. So, it's, it for sure grates on you. But there are people who get through it, like Bruce Springsteen. He's very, with his band. He's been with his band now since the early to mid 70s. It's had some turnover, but not a whole lot. And they've had times where there was about a 10-year period where they were broken up. But they came back together and they were stronger. So it does put a stress on your relationships, and it takes a strong personality. And it takes a personality really to get through that, who leans on faith. And I don't know, to get through it as most unscathed as you can. And I don't know how many of them do that.
Is there anything redemptive in the story of the Mamas and the Papas?
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, the story of it, they didn't really compromise, friendship or anything. And the story of them just banding together and uniting to make this thing happen and to get it off the ground is really inspirational, especially in the early years. And John's resilience to really make it in the pop field. In fact, in the early chapters, you're really kind of rooting for him. John comes in the book, and I mean, it's just naturally. It's not anything I did, but John comes off as a very unlikable guy when the story is all said and done. But in those early days, you're cheering for him, even though he's cheating on his wife, and he's getting into drinking and drugs and things like that. He's very focused and he's very driven, and he's very talented, and everybody I talked to who knew him, especially back in those days, loved him, or he's even still even his kids, as much as they've been through. You see them on talking on podcasts and in interviews, and they still love John as awful as he could be at times. That he had also a nice side to his personality, a bright side, and a lot of people loved him and still have good things to say about him. But he did go through a lot of he was a polarizing figure for a lot of people.
Um, were you a fan of the Mamas and the Papas before you set out to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed their music. I've always loved it. I've had their complete recordings for years, because I'm a fan of that music form, that idiom, that genre of folk rock, 60s rock. I wouldn't say I was like a super fan. Like I had posters in my room, and was the president of the Mamas and the Papas fan club. But I was certainly a fan of the Mamas and the Papas in the same way I was the fan of the Byrds and Simon and Garfunkel and so many other folk rock groups at that time.
Their music, I mean, I would imagine that everybody recognizes some of their most popular songs, like California Dreaming.
Right.
What is it that's so distinctive about their music that
Uh,
it stands the test of time?
Really, the harmony and the arrangements, and the production of it is very, very easy to listen to. John wrote some really great lyrics. He was really deep. He was a poet. When he was a kid, he had a love for poetry, and he was in military school as a young boy, and he would often and he hated it, and he would often seek solace through writing poetry. So, uh, it's very melodic, very harmonic. The songs are timeless in their arrangements, and it's recorded at a first-rate studio, Western Recorders in Los Angeles, with some of the finest musicians in that time and period, like Hal Blaine on drums and Larry Knechtel on piano, Joe Osborne on bass. A group that called themselves the Wrecking Crew, and there's a great documentary out on them and a book and soundtrack and all that. They played on just any 1960s hit from about 1964, 65 on, that was recorded in Los Angeles, and that's a lot of songs. They played on all the Beach Boys records. They were the backing band for that. Wasn't the Beach Boys playing those music, those instruments? It was the Wrecking Crew. It really lent a really great sound to his music. And Lou Adler, who was the producer, really taught John a lot. He had a great ear for music and arrangements himself, and stacking vocals, and you hear these records from back then, and the guitars are so loud and crisp, and they would be like, anywhere from two, three, up to 18 guys playing guitar in the studio at the same time, in unison with one another, and it would just raise up that sound quality. The same thing
Well,
with bass and piano. So it's just the approach to making music back in those days was just, I think it's one of the reasons why we still love it now. They don't do it like that anymore. It's too expensive, and people can do it in their home. And people have looked for a more simplistic approach, and almost prefer it, even though I think, a grandiose approach is oftentimes more gratifying.
Well, you mentioned your the year of your birth, and I'm thinking that you rejected the Casio keyboards of your youth
I
for the golden
I
oldies.
I did, man, and I think that was one of the reasons too, because these things were recorded in with with real people and in great studios, and some of them weren't even great studios. Like there's a song by the Five Satins called "In the Still of the Night," which was from the 50s that was recorded in the basement of a church in Connecticut,
Really?
but it sounds so great, and things like that. There's a lot of recordings, especially black music of the early to mid 50s. Before there's a lot of discrimination going on back in those days, as everybody well knows, and big labels weren't eager to hire African Americans or sign them, and they would make do, and they would record in just tiny little studios, in the bad side of town,
Wow.
and would just come out with just some, and they were so, the music was so great, and it was such great singing and musicianship, and it just lent it. People were just influenced by it. It almost became underground, and when things are underground, people love them.
Mhm.
It becomes like the forbidden fruit, and then it gets accepted, and then it gets into the mainstream, and it's a cycle that repeats itself constantly. And and that's for me, that's some of the music that's closest to my heart, and just listening to that.
Well, we both grew up in the New York metropolitan area. You were listening basically, if Cousin Brucey played it, you like it. It
Oh
sounds
yeah, I
like.
was total CBS FM nut. I even have all old air checks from back in those days that I listened to, that still make me feel pretty good, because that's got it with outside of Sirius XM, that's kind of gone the way of the dodo as well.
Well, I remember m- buying a Duran Duran cassette, and my parents always listened to, there was a country music station, and there was CBS FM.
Right.
Those are the two things that they they listened to in the morning when we were getting ready for school. And anyway, I remember one day my dad saying to me as I was playing, I don't know, whatever Duran Duran song, this people aren't going to be listening to this 30 years from now. And of course, people are listening to it, but I do remember about at that point hearing a Duran Duran song and saying, man, my dad, who's passed away, was right. This is not actually good music. But you don't actually have the same reaction to some of this music that you're
Well,
talking about, which
it's
is a real legacy.
it is, and it's but I disagree with the I love 80s music. I was a child of the 80s too, and it's
But there's
different.
a different quality to it,
Sure,
for
it's
sure.
different. It's a nostalgia thing. It's not as simplistic and things like that, as it was back in the day. But that's just because that's through natural progression. It's kind of like art. It's like early Christian art is not as nice or as beautiful as Renaissance
Sure.
Christian art. And um yeah, like 80s music to me, I'm very nostalgic for that. Like we said, I listen to CBS FM, but I was also a Z100 and a WPLJ kid too. Jim Kerr and Scott Shannon and the Z Morning Zoo and all them. I just love radio. So yeah, but it's funny because I think what really my parents really drew me, especially my father, drew me to the oldies, because I think when he hated that music too, so he's like, we're not listening to this in the car. We'll compromise, and he would put on CBS FM, and I was just drawn to it like a moth to a flame, and I still am, and then that's when the record collecting started, and it hasn't stopped.
So did you always want to go into radio?
Yeah, yeah, for a long time, probably really since the mid to late 80s, when I was a kid. It's something I'd always considered. I didn't go to it immediately after college, because everybody always told me you couldn't make any money in it. And although that's still true, you know, I wasn't making that much money doing anything else either. So I figured, well, might as well go into radio.
And how long have you been working for Sirius?
This is my 15th year. I
Okay,
just back in September would be my, actually, I count my internship, which was September of
fair
2007.
enough.
I was an unsuccessful salesman before that. And I came to radio, and I got fired from my sales job. And then I decided, radio's always been calling me. I told my wife, we weren't married. We'd only been married a year when that happened. And I told her, I was like, I just got to follow my heart. And so I went to broadcasting school. There's a Connecticut School of Broadcasting, and, it's like a 6-week course, and got an internship at first WDHA in New Jersey, and then Sirius XM after that for the fall of 2007, and have been there ever since.
What's your favorite thing about radio?
Um, Probably, I mean, there's so many different things. My favorite thing about radio is listening to really great people do their trade. And that can be anywhere from, Cousin Brucey or Gus Lloyd, my host, who is a great talk show host,
Which is
to
the morning show on the Catholic channel.
the morning show on Catholic Channel. I don't listen to him much these days, but Howard Stern was always somebody I listened to him as a teenager, and the type of radio he did it impeccably well. It was just it was just done great. It was he came through they called them the shock jocks, like Don Imus and other people like that, and he just did that superbly. So that was always something I enjoyed. I'm a big Wolfman Jack fan. He died when I was about 19 years old, but through the movie American Graffiti, I came to really love his sound and his story. He would play on these border radio stations in Mexico that would have 250,000 watts, which was illegal in the United States. So it would blast it across half of the United States and up into Canada. So it's almost kind of like Sirius satellite radio. You could drive from one end of the country to the other and hear the Wolfman Jack show on XERB or XERF before that. And it's just, the fact that he had this mysterious quality of nobody really knowing who he was or where he came from. They didn't know if he was a white guy, if he was black, if some people said he was Mexican, and so he had this, and he was in love with the music that he played. He just absolutely was thrilled by it. He loved it. And it came across, and there's a handful of air checks from those days, from the 60s and early 70s, that are out there floating. And I love listening to them. And just to hear it, because it's a really when radio is done right, it's really a great medium, a really entertaining medium, and I love it.
What's kind of key to getting radio right?
Uh, Repetition is, practice and repetition, and just really energy, and just getting that across on the airwaves. And it's not easy. It comes easy to some people, but I've done enough shows where I've produced enough shows of potential hosts where I can tell you it ain't easy. You got to know your subject, and you got to be excited about your subject, and you got to make that excitement come across the airwaves, which it's not always easy to do.
And I don't think people appreciate the work that goes into it. I mean, obviously he was well compensated, but I was a close for a while to Rush Limbaugh, and I was amazed by the amount of time he put into a 3-hour show.
Oh, right. And he's probably the godfather of political AM talk radio. I mean,
Right.
and nobody did it better than him.
But
And
he didn't phone it in. I mean, he was
no,
putting
no,
real
but
work and study into it.
and he came up, just like Wolfman Jack and Cousin Brucey, spinning top 40 records on a radio
Right.
station in, I think, Western Pennsylvania. So, he had that down, how to get a thought across. And I try to do this in my writing, really try to get across a thought across in as short a period, as much as information as you can, in as short a time as a sentence or paragraph as you can.
And I remember too, there was a brilliance to I guess after you're doing it for a while. I remember he can't get mad at me for telling the story because he's gone to God, but we pray. And he one day read a piece when I was editor of National Review Online. It was actually a parody, and I'm not sure he knew it was a parody.
Uh-oh.
So I email him quickly during the commercial break, and he comes back and just, I can't remember exactly how he did it, but it was, now of course that was a parody, or however he did it. It was just, it was flawless. But I'm certain he didn't know it was a parody.
Yeah, right. Like
Like nobody listening knew.
George Bush meets with alien at Camp David, something
Yeah,
like that.
right. I think it was something about the liberal media, so it was believable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can throw anything against that and make it stick.
There you go. That's exactly it. Exactly it. Um, so going back to the mamas and the papas, I should ask you a pretty fundamental question here. Do you have a favorite song?
California Dreamin' is yeah, California Dreamin' is probably my favorite song. I mean, just because it's been with me the longest, and it has that intro is just so incredible, and it really puts you in that time and place. I mean, it's not a political song. It's not really, it's just a song that Michelle and John wrote 2 years before it was recorded about missing home, about she grew up in California and they were living in New York City in Greenwich Village. It was a very cold winter in 1963. And they had taken a walk and they stopped into a church. They passed along the way. It was Old St. Pat's Cathedral. I'm sure you've been there.
Yeah,
You,
I
you
I
know?
had no idea until your book that
Yeah.
that church was Old St. Patrick's.
Yeah, well, it's funny because in Michelle's autobiography, she said they walked to St. Patrick's Cathedral, but if it's really cold outside and you're down in Greenwich Village, that's a long
You're not
walk
walking all the way up there.
So I'm sure she probably meant Old St. Pat's, which is on Mott Street, and it's kind of the heart of that community down there. And it's just the way that song came together. There are others like some deeper tracks, like Even If I Could. They did a great um, cover of Bobby Freeman's 1958 hit "Do You Want to Dance," which I mentioned in the book. Bobby Freeman, his version was a real rocket, early, late 50s rock and roll record. It was really frenetic and fast paced, and they slow it down, and they make it a slow dancer. And they just do Lou Adler and John just did an incredible arrangement with that song with nice strings, and Denny really sang a beautiful beautiful. His tenor on that was absolutely superb. So that's another one of my favorites of theirs. There's a lot of them. So they don't have that many songs but there's hardly one that you can just turn your nose at and say, that's no good.
Well, I was talking to our mutual friend Gary Jansen, and he one of the things he wanted to know is, he said the breakup of Mamas and the Papas was kind of sudden at the end.
Right.
And what was that like for all of them, and what is the ultimate legacy?
Well, there was two breakups. They broke up in 68 and then they broke up again finally in 1971. Now 1968, it just kind of petered out. I think John was exhausted. His marriage to Michelle was ending. He was drying up. He had, as a writer, he was really struggling coming up with new material. And they recorded "Dream a Little Dream" with Cass on lead vocals, which was an old song from the 1930s, and that really jump started Mama Cass's solo career, Cass Elliot, and she really left and didn't look back. And Denny was kind of sinking more and more into alcoholism, which he would eventually overcome that, but at that time it really kind of overtook him, as it does at anybody. And so they went their separate ways for about 3 years, and then they got a notice that they were being sued for $1 million by the record label because they owed them another record. And so they rather than each of them shelling out $250,000, they decided, well, let's get back together and record this album real quick. And they did. They put together, an album that's always, even by the members, has always been trash, which I think is great. I think it's called People Like Us. It's different. It doesn't sound like the Mamas and the Papas of the 1960s, but in 1971, you can't make a record that sounds like 1966 and be successful. You got to move with the times, and John really did. He put together these songs very quickly, but I thought they came off very well. And then after that, the record it was not successful. It didn't really chart. A couple of the singles charted very, very low outside the top 100. And that was it. They went their separate ways again. And then 3 years later, you know, Cass passed away from heart failure, and that was it. John put together a different version of the Mamas and the Papas in the 1980s, kind of a touring version. They did record some stuff that was never released. But it had Denny Doherty in it for a little while, and they brought in Spanky McFarlane from Spanky and Our Gang, who she had a big booming voice and was part of the late 1960s pop scene. But Cass is really irreplaceable. And although Spanky did a good job, she was ultimately just kind of fizzled out. And then Denny left, and there was always an alternating cast of characters, and then for the next 10, 15 years. And then we lost John in 2001, and then Denny in, I believe, 2007. And Michelle's still with us, just turned 79, I think. Yeah, 79.
Is there a legacy and impact that they've made on music besides, the harmony and things that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, it's not profound like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, but anytime singers get together in four-part harmony, you can't help but bring up memories of the Mamas and the Papas, who for rock and roll, folk rock really did the best job of that. There's other harmony groups like the Four Seasons and the Beach Boys, but they're kind of relegated to oldies acts, and really the Mamas and the Papas kind of are too, but I think there's a little bit more cutting edge from that time period with them than there are the other two. Well, maybe with the exception of the Beach Boys, but at that time, the Beach Boys were kind of looked upon as kind of square. At that point in time, they eventually overcame that. But for the Mamas and the Papas, where they were four-part harmony hippies, and that has aged very well, in this culture. And so yeah, anytime four-part harmony is sung in a rock idiom, I think it conjures up memories and aspirations of sounding like the Mamas and the Papas.
What, I think we think, and we touched upon this earlier, rock and roll isn't associated with the best of morals. And yet, we both just talked about earlier our families and listening to, the oldies,
Yeah.
with because of our parents, right?
Hmm.
How do you kind of like, thinking in terms of culture, because this is part of what you do, what the Catholic channel does, how does it contribute to culture in a positive way, even in the midst of the moral mess of it?
It can bring a lot of people together. Music really does that. I think music does that better than anything. Like I've said this before in interviews. My father-in-law is very politically liberal, and my father is very politically conservative. Now they have limited contact with each other because my dad lives in Virginia, and my father-in-law lives in Pennsylvania, and the paths don't cross too much. But they both love doo-wop. They both love music from the 50s, and if we put that on, that's something that they can both enjoy and talk about. And I think it's the same for a lot of people. I think it's a great healer, a great unifier. It can also be divisive. A lot of music today is very divisive. It kind of echoes the modern culture. But the music from way back, I think it's even to this day, music from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and even into the 80s, uh, is a lot of younger people are drawn to it because of its harmony, because of its simplicity, because of its positive message. And it fills a hole, a gap that's just not being filled by the current music scene, And the current music scene is all about, a lot of it is sexual, overtly sexual, and even, uh, with the drug culture, fascinated with the drug culture, and even violence at some point, or very self-obsessed, with me and my and stuff like that, not about us and we. And I think that music from that time period really fills that gap for a lot of people.
Well, and there's a trauma about some of the current music, and I don't pretend to be an expert, but you know, because you have to produce my radio spots on the Catholic channel. I've spent a little time outside abortion clinics,
Right.
and I remember one day after I was doing that, again, I'm making obvious I'm not an expert on contemporary music, but the Rihanna's song Rude Boy was playing like in an Uber or something.
Hmm.
And it's all about like using him before he uses you. And
Yeah.
I'm like, these poor girls, like
I,
this
I
is the
know.
culture they're living in, right? And
And
not to be nostalgic about the 60s, right? But there is a more natural kind of like, girl falling in love with boy kind of nature to the
yeah,
songs.
I think we all have, I think we would all prefer that,
Right.
and I mean, what's the value in that? I mean, you won up somebody, ooh, great, you won the day, so, yeah, good luck with that. It's like there's got to be more to that. There's got to be happiness. There's got to be joy. A lot of people don't know happiness and they don't know joy. And again, it's because we are becoming an increasingly secular culture, and you can't really have true happiness and true joy without God in your life in some way, shape, or form.
And do you in your reading and study of so many musicians, do you see anyone finding God in the midst of the mess?
Oh yeah, I mean it's happened. I mean I know Bob Dylan had his Christian period in the late 70s, and I to my knowledge it stuck. I don't know, he's keeps everything very close to the vest, and he's not a very public person. But I can't help but think that it stuck with him in some kind of way and gave him some kind of peace of mind, and things that he probably still practices and relies on today. Yeah, Dion is a great Dion DiMucci, who you remember, you referenced. He was the lead singer of Dion and the Belmonts, and then he went solo, and then he had a struggle with heroin in the 1960s, and he got clean in the late 1960s, really after a spiritual conversion. And or and he had a lot of trauma. He was with Buddy Holly when Buddy Holly died, um, on that tour, on that plane crash. So, and I know he had a rough childhood. I think, his parents were loving, but I know that, he grew up pretty poor. And and that era, even loving parents were pretty rough, could be pretty rough around the edges. It harkens back to the pre-media era parent, so so yeah, you do see it, and I don't know how many of them are public about it, you know, but you can always, maybe kind of tell when somebody's, usually, they kind of mellow out as they get older. I know Bruce Springsteen too. I don't know about him being a practicing Catholic, but he's very embracing now of his Catholic upbringing, whereas he wasn't always,
Mhm.
So there's been some sort of conversion there at some point. I don't know what level. Don't want to venture a guess.
Right, right.
That's all his business. But he seems joyous and happy, and he was never really an angry guy. But he went through his traumas, and wrote about them and talked about them on stage, and sang about it also. It does happen, but I think in that medium you really got to keep it close to the vest, because it is really such an anti-religious environment and culture.
Um, I noticed the other day, I think one of John Philip's children was on your Facebook page, saying he was reading the book. Do
Right.
you do you have what is your impression of what rock and roll does to the children?
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, it can be really bad. And that's not always the case. I mean, like, again, I reference Springsteen again. He seems to have a very close relationship with his children, and you see Paul McCartney and with his and others. But there's a lot of damage along the way. I know John Phillips's children suffered emotionally, and you still see them going through a lot of suffering and dealing with that to this day. And so many others. It's just that's part of the collateral damage, I think, of being in that culture and seeking that stardom, and being that talented. Because when you are that talented and you reach that level of fame, it's really singular. It's really self-focused, and it's it it causes a lot of people to really, I hate to say, objectify their children and just use them as, just not even really think of them as people with feelings and emotions and how this is going to affect them. I'm sure a lot of people would blanch at that, but I think it's true. It may not be as true now as it was back in those days, I hope, but human nature is still human nature. So
Right.
um, you know, I hope it's not, but it's hard to it's that duality is really tough, to be a great dad and to be a super talented superstar at the same time, or
Well,
mom.
it's not the same thing, but you were talking earlier about egos in, Catholic radio. I know, 25 plus years in conservative journalism, you get writers get like the wrong feedback sometimes, and it can really mess with your head. I've
Oh
really
yeah,
seen it. Um, and I mean, and that's just a little little window into what someone in rock and roll would be dealing with, I can't even imagine. I had a moment when Robin Williams died, the comedian. I watched Mork and Mindy when I was a kid, loved Dead
yeah,
Poets Society because I was, 12 years old and into that poetry and everything else.
right, yeah,
And anyway, I remembered I was pretty sure I had never prayed for him. And I thought, wow, I mean, that's like an indictment. I'm not saying
right.
I'm at fault for his death by suicide, but we should do more of that. If you love some band,
Oh,
or listen to the
absolutely.
band.
Yeah, I do it. I do it quite frequently. I'm always praying for, John Lennon or Elvis Presley or even John Phillips and Mama Cass and Papa Denny, and anybody, especially if it's because I do I update my social medias pretty regularly, and I always see the list of people who died that on this day, because you always want to find out what happened on that day, and you can't help but, oh, when you're thinking about them and you're just doing your morning prayers or something, it's like, well, let me include you know Bobby V in my prayers, or Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, or somebody like that. And it feels weird because a lot of these people, like Elvis Presley, to me is almost like a fictional character, because I was 1 year old when he died. There was never a time where there was hardly a time on this planet where Elvis and I were here at the same time. And all I've seen is him in movies and pictures and in music. So it almost seems like he's not even a real person. So it can feel kind of weird to people, I think, to pray for, like, oh, this person. And we have a tendency to be judgmental. Like, oh, they lived a horrible life. I mean, what's the point of praying? But no, you really should, because you don't know what happened with them at I heard a priest once tell me, asking about Judas, if whether Judas was in hell or not, and he's like, I don't know, I don't make any kind of judgments on that. I don't know what happened from the time he put that rope around his neck and jumped, and what happened between the time he jumped and hit the
Right.
hit the ground. So it costs you nothing to pray for him. So it's really something we should do. Absolutely.
Well, and also this is a cool catechetical moment because even, we're both Catholic, and even in the Catholic context, so often you go to a funeral mass and everyone, including the priest, acts like the person is in heaven, and we don't know that.
Right.
And we do believe that there's a time for purification, and that time, we don't even have a concept of what that time looks like. And so it is important to pray for people, not only in the months, the days and months after they die, but years
Right.
later. And God doesn't waste any prayers. So if Elvis Presley is in heaven,
Yeah.
you're praying for somebody else who needs the prayers, who
Yeah. And another
no one knows, maybe.
Another priest also said it very well one time in a homily. He said, "When I die, I know I'm certain of two things. There's going to be a lot of people in heaven I didn't think would be there, and a lot of people not there that I thought would be." So,
Mm,
you know, so
right, right.
so it's something that that we should all think about it, because it helps ourselves. It gives us people who champion us and champion our cause.
Yeah, and you talk about, how judgmental we are. I mean, we have no idea what's going on in another person's heart,
No.
when
Or what they're struggling with. Their
exactly.
traumas,
Right.
that lead to certain behaviors.
Yeah, no, certainly the older I get, the more I appreciate how much people are suffering in ways that they can't fully communicate even.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you have another book in the works?
I do. I'm working on a book on Waylon Jennings right now. He was a country singer who's the height of his fame was the mid to late 70s, and into the 80s, and but he had been around since the late 50s. He made his first. He was a protege of Buddy Holly, who we mentioned before, Dion's good friend, and was on that same tour with Dion. In fact, I spoke to Dion a little bit about him a few weeks ago. And so I'm really focusing on the first 15 years of his professional career, which was a struggle. He started recording professionally in 1959, but he didn't really hit it big until 1974. So it was a 15-year struggle with between dealing with Buddy's death, and then starting his own career, and then getting signed to RCA, and then really struggling with the Nashville studio and label system down there, which at that time, and I think even maybe still be today, is very exclusive, and um, it's a very difficult place to work, and to kind of get your ideas across. And he was a very driven, individualistic a guy, who really knew what was best for him. And there's a lot of people who say that, but in terms of it played out in time that he was absolutely right, that he knew what was best for him. So we're going to talk about how he got to that point.
So how did you pick him as your next topic?
I have been a fan of his really since I was a little kid with the Dukes of Hazzard, because he sang the Dukes of Hazzard theme song, you know. But really, when I was in high school, probably 17 or 18, I got into his music, and just fell in love with it. And I've been familiar with his story, and it's just another one of those things. It's stories out there, it's been told, but it hasn't really been explored. It hasn't been picked up and shaken up and dusted off. And it's kind of like the Mamas and the Papas story. It's like the Mamas and the Papas story was out there, but it was in all different places, and it really hadn't been updated in a long, long time. So I was able to kind of consolidate it all into one stop for everybody. So I'm kind of doing the same with Waylon Jennings.
Was there anything in particular that surprised you about the Mamas and the Papas when you dived in?
I've been asked that question, and it's always one of those things that I struggle to answer, because I knew a lot, about their story. But I think really just the level of dysfunction that from almost immediately from when they signed their record contract, through the remainder of their time together. And then really, I think readers are going to be just absolutely blown away by, and I know this from reviews on the book and talking with people who've read it, John's involvement in the Monterey Pop Festival, and really how he made it. It wasn't his idea, it was brought to him, but he took it over and turned it into what it became. And it's really a cultural landmark, and the start of rock music festivals. It begot Woodstock and everything that came after that. And just his vision for it really set the tone, and just see how involved he was and how he put it all together, and just how chaotic it was. As it's almost a metaphor for the Mamas and the Papas, how chaotic it was as it was going on.
Well, Scott Shea, thank you so much for talking about your book, All the Leaves Are Brown, how the Mamas and the Papas came together and broke
There it
apart.
is.
It's it's a great gift book for someone who loves music. If you get an Amazon gift card for Christmas, you might enjoy buying a copy for yourself. And it's go ahead.
And if I can just say, you don't have to be a fan of the Mamas and the Papas. The book, what I set out to do was really, through the story of the Mamas and the Papas, tell the story of the music, the rock and roll music industry from the 50s through the 60s and into the early 70s. So if you love music from that time period, and you'll love it because it really brings it all together and puts the Mamas and Papas into that story.
Well, and I'll add, as somebody who is not necessarily doesn't necessarily read books about musicians, you're a great storyteller. And this is contemporary American history in a sense too. And so yeah, if you just want to hear a window into this part of history, Scott, you do a great job with that, and Variety agrees.
Well, I thank you, and I thank Variety.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.